1 minute more. I'm very excited for this talk. It's made me think about my journey, and narrative and how it fits together.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Well, I hope you're going to tell us about it.
You're going to tell us about it.
Well, I just know the theory. I don't know the story. You do the story. I only do the theory of the story.
Oh, no, that's not true. I think we all live it, don't we? Okay,
Yeah.
that's good. Yeah. So hello everyone. Welcome to All About Ibogaine, a Thursday podcast that I started right after Trump's executive order that happened a few weeks ago in April. And the reason I started this um, was to speak to and get knowledge about Ibogaine from people who've been working with this medicine for a really long time, long before it became a household word probably on people's lips who are following Trump's, political the things that he's doing in terms of legal changes in the psychedelic world, which is really huge. And so, Martie, I'm really excited to speak with Martie Underwood, who is the founder and program director at Magali's Wellness Center in near Johannesburg, South Africa. And she's also a psychologist and an author, and she has just written this beautiful book called Integrating Ibogaine. The tagline, Martie, can you do the tagline?
A narrative approach to meaning, identity, and lasting change.
Right. Um, and I read the synopsis. I haven't read the book yet, but everything that Martie's saying about the place that um, the narrative arc of your journey and your life and what what that is and how that changes and how by changing the way you frame yourself, this is how I see it. I'm sure you have something to add to it, but by changing the way you frame your narrative and or how you perceive it, it shifts your character, because you do say that character is a product or a adaptation based on your life, right? So and that whole the implication of that idea, that narrative, can the way you narrate what's happening to you can change your life, is really profound. And so please welcome Martie Underwood. um,
Much. Thank you so much for the opportunity also to speak about this topic.
yeah, absolutely. So before we dive into the book, can you tell us a little bit about your origin story, how Ibogaine came into your life and what you do now?
Okay. I studied transpersonal psychology for my master's degree, and I've always been interested in non-ordinary states of consciousness. I think that was really what drew me into the master's degree work. I'd taken quite a lot of psychedelics recreationally in my youth, but stopped doing that way by the time that I got to the master's. And looking at the healing potential of non-ordinary states of consciousness is really what fascinated me. And this went to, meditation or hypnosis or shamanic journeying, and all these types of modalities, and the altered states and the healing potential thereof, I think was what I was interested in. So when Ibogaine came across my path, and it's one of those things that I can't really tell you how I came to know about Ibogaine. It's like one day I didn't know about Ibogaine, and the next day I did know about Ibogaine, and I became really fascinated by this medicine. I think specifically because it doesn't have a recreational appeal. And even though I respect and revere and like other psychedelics, I was really interested in this therapeutic potential of Ibogaine as a medicine that can be used to induce a non-ordinary state. So that's really what drew me to Ibogaine, and how I became interested in this field.
Muted. And then did you actually take Ibogaine? Did you have an experience with Ibogaine or Iboga in that process?
Well, that had a story of its own. I think when I became interested in Ibogaine, I was looking for somebody to work in South Africa, and at the time, the only person that was really very reputable in close proximity to where I lived, working with Ibogaine, was a woman called Ansu Talyat, and she was a clinical psychologist. Ended up being my business partner and my mentor. So when I got in touch with her and started looking at Ibogaine, I made a very conscious decision at the beginning. I think as an academic, when this idea formed in my mind that I wanted to pursue a PhD and I wanted to pursue a PhD having my topic around Ibogaine, I made a very conscious effort in the first year of working with Ibogaine not to take Ibogaine. And that was an interesting experience. In some ways, sitting in front of somebody who's just coming out of an Ibogaine journey, having some idea of what non-ordinary states can do and how people experiencing them, but having no first-hand experience of Ibogaine, was a unique and interesting experience. And I felt that I needed that academic non-bias as far as possible to really just sit and listen and reflect on what people are telling me. And that year was profoundly insightful in terms of how people experience Ibogaine. But then there came a point in my own journey working with Ibogaine where it didn't make sense not to have my own experience with Ibogaine. It kind of got to that sort of data point of saturation where you've heard so many different people's experiences that you need, or I needed, a first-hand experience of what this medicine is like. So my first year into working with Ibogaine, I took Ibogaine and it absolutely blew my mind from every point of view. There's nothing really quite like it. And still, I feel that way. And I see that with clients as well. We struggle to articulate exactly what the Ibogaine experience is. And that's a unique and magical thing.
Yeah. So then, as a psychologist, as a medical clinical person, would you say that because it's really against the norm in the medical field for people to actually experience the medicines that they're giving, but psychedelics are different, and particularly ibogaine, right? Would you say that it's important for someone to do it before they prescribe it?
I don't know if it's necessarily important to do it before you prescribe it. And I think when I started this journey 8 years ago, certainly at that time, it was very frowned upon still in the academic community to take psychedelics, to work with psychedelics, to teach psychedelics, to administer psychedelics, having had your own firsthand experience. I think that's changed a lot. I think a lot of clinicians now working, a lot of researchers and academics working with psychedelics have had their own firsthand experiences. So I think that's changed a lot. I don't know if you necessarily need to have experienced it to prescribe it. I think a lot of people who work with it very successfully maybe haven't taken it, and specifically in the medical space and psychiatrists and psychologists. I do think if this is a path that you're pursuing, if you're pursuing working with Ibogaine, certainly at some point having your own experience with the medicine, I think should be a prerequisite in some ways to truly understand what this medicine does and how to work with it in a way. But I don't know if everybody working in the field necessarily needs to have a first-hand experience. I think compassion and empathy and the ability to just put yourself in someone else's shoes and to understand what they're going through is really all that is needed. And understanding, I suppose, the concept of a process. A lot of the people working with Ibogaine in the beginning days of Ibogaine needed that first-hand experience. And as the field develops, I think, and research is developing, more and more conceptual frameworks come to light of how to look at Ibogaine and how to understand it. And that first-hand experience becomes something that is in addition to what you already know rather than a prerequisite, I think.
Yeah, the dimension that ibogaine adds to your own journey, even if you've taken other psychedelics and have had a lot of things like that, or have never, like Dr. Deborah Mash will not, on principle, won't take ibogaine, and she's successfully run a clinic. So I know that what you're saying is absolutely true, that you don't have to. However, the gift that ibogaine is worth experiencing, I think. Um, yeah.
Agreed.
um, so so now you run Majali's Wellness Center, and you work with Iboga and Ibogaine. Can you talk a little bit about what you do at the clinic and what kind of people you see?
In the beginning years of Mahali's working with Ansu, so she started, she's the founder actually of what we have. I joined her in 2019. She passed away from cancer in 2021, so we had a few years of working together. Primarily at that time, sort of 2/3 of the clients that we were working with at that time, 8 years ago, were substance use disorder clients. And mostly people who accessed Ibogaine for that reason. I think when I started 8 years ago, there was a small sort of movement towards PTSD, and Ibogaine potentially being something that can work for PTSD. Ansu and herself, as a clinical psych, had a lot of experience working with various types of PTSD cases at that point. But primarily at that time, 2/3 substance use disorders. And over the last 8 years, that's changed significantly for us. Whereas now we still work with substance use disorders, but primarily we see clients who access Ibogaine for various types of reasons. A lot of what I would categorize as sort of medical case studies, people who look at Ibogaine as a potential for Parkinson's or MS or certain types of pain injuries. Certainly we see clients with PTSD, depression, anxiety, and also still clients who access Ibogaine for substance use disorders. So our practice has changed significantly over the years, and in the last year specifically moved away, I think, from primarily focusing on flood dose experiences to different types of protocols. And that's really where my head is at, is starting to experiment with different ways of working with Ibogaine. And we can get into that, but the sort of this prevailing idea, I think, in the Ibogaine space at the moment, that the Ibogaine state of consciousness or the Ibogaine journey and the insight that comes with it is revered as sort of the moment that things can change. And I have a different view of that. I think Ibogaine can work from an insight, understanding, from a narrative perspective in a very adaptive way, using different types of protocols, and that a flood dose protocol is not the only way to achieve the magic of what it is that Ibogaine, or the gift that Ibogaine has to give.
Even with serious illnesses like addiction, are you saying that it works even for the non-flood dose protocol, whatever you call it, works even for things like addiction?
I think there are certain approaches that work better for certain things. In my experience, a slower approach working with Ibogaine at, what some people call a mesodose or a slow dose protocol, in my opinion, that's more effective for substance use disorders than a flood dose. But it also depends on the substance that you're working with. If you are a clinic who's detoxing from opioids, then certainly a slow dose needs to be done in a very careful way. So we don't do that at all. We don't work with opioids at all. But I think for substance use disorders, a slower approach working with Ibogaine is in a lot of ways a more effective approach, and it ties into the ideas of the book of how you integrate Ibogaine in a narrative way. And for somebody who's been struggling with a substance use disorder for a very long time, the scaffolding of their identity, who they are and how they think of themselves, has become very narrow. And it's become narrowly focused around the lifestyle and the identity changes that the substance has brought into your life. And in a way, dismantling that very narrow framing of identity needs a slower approach in working with Ibogaine. And the flood dose itself can sometimes almost take the place of a different kind of feel good, without knowing that the scaffolding needs to be in place to sustain that feel good and to sustain that meaningful change.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. Like, in my experience, and I was addicted to sugar and to smoking, but not to something serious. But in my experience, there were a number of things in my life that were unreconciled by me, that I was using these addictions to kind of suppress or manage or whatever, and I think whether you're quote unquote in addiction or not, there is some method in which you're suppressing things in your life. And so it's not going to all surface at once. It's a journey of, and the Ibogaine kind of opens it, or a big journey with entheogens, even psilocybin opens it, and then integration is the pathway, like where you can reclaim it, because that's almost like I would love to hear your corroboration, or if you see it this way, that's almost like a it gave you access to a higher frequency of consciousness for a little while, and you could see things really clearly, and you could see yourself with some detachment. And that's what you talk about, that the narrative thing. So let's just jump right into that. And can you talk a little bit about the narrative, the narrative, what you mean by your subtitle about the narrative being important for lasting change?
Okay. I think a couple of things that I wanted to highlight. So Ibogaine, I talk about it as a narrative dissociative in the book, in terms of how the substance manifests both in the flood dose experience and other types of protocols. And the dissociative very reliably creates this sense of metacognition, of being able to observe from an observer's perspective yourself. And that provides insight into who you are. And what the narrative self is the narrative self is how we understand ourselves based on the story of our lives. And this can happen in adaptive ways, but it can also happen in maladaptive ways. To give you an example, for instance, if you go through your childhood experience and something very profound happens to you and your family, let's say your house burns down, and you lose all of your possessions in a very, very traumatic experience, but somehow the family pulls together and pulls the resources, and other members of the community help, and you build yourself back up. And as a family, you get yourself going, and you as a member of a family participates in that experience. The idea that shapes in your mind is that you are a person who can be resilient when life throws a challenge at you, because that experience taught you that. And that's an adaptive way of how the narrative self shapes throughout our lives. And there are various life experiences that give us these adaptive transformations in our narrative self. But on the opposite end of the scale, there are also maladaptive ways in the way that we can form who we are and who we are as people and how we think of ourselves. For instance, if you come from a background where you needed to be particularly hostile, or the people around you were hostile, then hostility becomes a defense mechanism in the way that sometimes you conduct relationships, whether that's work relationships or personal romantic relationships. And hostility becomes this very rigid defense mechanism. And that is a maladaptive way in which the narrative identity shapes. So Ibogaine, as this narrative dissociative, gives you insight into this hostile aspect of your personality. And that can happen reliably, whether it's in the flood dose altered state of consciousness or post a slower dose protocol as this metacognitive understanding of self, that, oh, I don't think I am really a hostile person. How did this happen? How did I become this way? Where do I use it? Is it a defense mechanism? Is it part of my personality? And that's where that interrogation process begins, or that looking at your life from a sort of fresh perspective in terms of how your character traits or personality traits developed, and to celebrate the adaptive ones and to put them in the corner, and to look at the maladaptive ones in a more sort of detached metacognitive perspective, which is an observer's perspective. And that's the other thing that Ibogaine, this metacognitive dissociative aspect, is you can look at these aspects of yourself from a metacognitive, a detached and observer's perspective. And that takes away this aspect of shame. I need to feel shame for this aspect of my personality that is maladaptive. And it allows you to engage with that maladaptive aspect with curiosity, rather than this aspect of something that is shameful that needs to be hidden. And that's not to say after an Ibogaine journey that every single aspect that is maladaptive will come to the surface and magically you can all sort of engage with them without shame. It's a far more nuanced and layered approach, in the sense that some things may require years and years before you find the maturity or the authenticity in yourself to really look at a particularly maladaptive part of your personality, with kindness and with compassion. That might not just be available after the first Ibogaine journey, so to say.
Right. Yeah. Um, uh, for me, trauma didn't surface until like 15 years after I'd been doing psychedelic journeys for a long and big ones. But the trauma didn't surface until and I feel like it's when you're psychologically ready, like you said, but also you have to have the strength to go through it. just like Ibogaine itself, you have to have the strength, a certain kind of psychological strength to go through it and to be willing to look at these things in yourself. Can you give some examples of how this works with has worked with clients? Like, how does it? What happens? How do you detach yourself, for example, with something you've got strong emotions about?
I'll use a recent example of a client who she did 3 Ibogaine journeys, and each journey was 2 years apart. And when she came to us the first time, she had no substance use disorders. She was curious about accessing Ibogaine for psychospiritual development, and certainly quite a lot of trauma in her background. And what the first Ibogaine journey did is really kind of dealing with the sort of outer layer of the narrative self onion, if you will, like who I am, how I relate to the world. And it's almost easily identifiable, that outward layer of trauma. Most of us know we carry it, but we've never really had the opportunity to confront it. And that can be confronted either in the journey space itself. In other words, Ibogaine brings that into your visual or thought or audio field, auditory field in the Ibogaine journey. Or, this can follow as a realization or insight process after the Ibogaine journey. This is who I am, this is how I relate to the world, this is the trauma that's happened to me. And then 2 years later, when she came for her second Ibogaine journey, it definitely went to a layer of the onion that is much deeper, that is much more nuanced. And instead of dealing with sort of the outer layer stuff, and the outer layer stuff seems to be my life, my trauma, the things that I've been through, the easily identifiable things. And then this layer down really goes to the nuanced understanding of who I am. How do I relate? Like, what is authentic? What is not authentic? Also depends on like where you are in your life. She started in her early 30s and matured all the way through her late 30s. So there's also an emotional maturity process in the background that will happen regardless of Ibogaine. And this changes how you relate to yourself at any point in your life. But with her journey specifically, these 3 journeys, each layer of the onion became deeper and deeper into a sense of authenticity. The first time I met her, and she's a dear and beautiful person, I found her quite performative in some ways. And that is a defense mechanism that we use when we don't want to feel vulnerable. And when I saw her the last time now for the third Ibogaine journey, I said to her, I think this is the most authentic version of you that I've ever met. It's real, it's raw, it's truthful in every sense of the word. And that's, I think, the ability to really kind of go into those much deeper layers of who you are as a person. And because Ibogaine provides that from this metacognitive perspective. And metacognitive is this ability that also mindfulness teaches, to look at yourself from a detached perspective, not as a first person, but from a curiosity perspective, looking at your dysfunction without this condemnation or without this sense of judgment. One of the things that came out of the PhD research when I researched the narrative self is that Ibogaine adaptively transforms self-judgment. So it softens the judgment that we hold, which under normal circumstances, maybe we can't access that softening of the judgment we hold for ourselves. And Ibogaine, and whether it's through the metacognitive perspective or a different mechanism, seems to be able to soften the self-judgment that gives you the opportunity and the tools to look at these maladaptive aspects with a sense of curiosity rather than judgment or shame.
Right. Well, so I see that as this old-fashioned term, ego death, and it's also more like a spiritual term, which is not used so much. But that is literally what is happening. That is what the ego death is, in my view, is this detachment, which is a high spiritual quality in Buddhism and in many other. Detachment is a powerful thing, and detachment isn't like a cold remoteness. That's not what it is. It's this dynamic. You're connecting with your self-love in some way that's really dynamic, and you're able to then look at your own foibles with compassion. So that's kind of the shift that you're saying Ibogaine initiates. But then you're talking about a process that happens long after the Ibogaine. And so can you talk a little bit about that? Can walk us through what is happening afterwards, and are there like highlights to what's happening in, as a process, because it must have some commonalities. Yeah.
I want to go to a point that you raised about ego death. When I studied transpersonal psychology, one of my lecturers, Harris Friedman, impressed the pants off me in terms of what he communicated about the difference between ego death and self-expansiveness. So he called it self-expansiveness as a process, and saying that ego death and self-expansiveness, from his point of view, is ultimately the same process, but that an expanded version of self means nothing of the ego has really died. It has just taken the passenger seat, and there's an expanded version or an expanded understanding of who you are. And that allows the ego to kind of sit in the center, in the place where it's needed, but not always, in the sort of driver seat of things.
I like
So
that.
that I've always resonated with that rather than the sort of ego death part of it, because I've always thought, we need our ego. Our ego is our safety mechanism, it's our survival tactic. If we don't have that, we're in trouble. If somebody pulls a knife out, you're not going to debate them into letting it go. You're going to react. You're going to react from that instinctual place, and that's our ego needing to protect us. But it can also be profoundly, profoundly maladaptive in the way that it features in our lives. In terms of the process for I think using the narrative self as a framework around an Ibogaine journey, I think starts with mapping. And there are a couple of things in the mapping process from an ethics perspective to always be aware of. One of our colleagues in the Ibogaine community, one of the longest debates I've had was about the difference between priming and preparation. And I think for facilitators of this work, it's so important to prepare people for the work, but not to prime people for the work. And priming is about predicting a specific experience that you might have. And the narrative in the Ibogaine community that's out there to an extent already does this idea of a life review. Very often clients don't experience a life review, and then they think they failed or they did something wrong, or Ibogaine didn't work for them because they didn't have a life review. Not everybody has a life review, and not everybody's meant to have a life review. So it's about setting the stage from a preparation perspective to help people understand. And very often it's about letting go of some of those expectations up front, almost like deconstructing some of those preconceived narratives as to what Ibogaine would be. That is part of the preparation process, helping people to understand that their experience with Ibogaine is unique to them. This medicine is highly intelligent. It works with each individual mind in such a specific way that there is, for us as the facilitators, no way to predict what the contents of any Ibogaine experience is going to be like. And to help people prepare from that perspective, and the preparation is around the type of space that you can make in your life, helping somebody to map their life story. And the mapping of a life story, I think, is an incredibly important part for the facilitator, because that's really where you identify where some of the pressure points may be for somebody as they go through the integration process, or what some of the things are that need to be decoded or deconstructed or helped to interpret, without imposing frameworks on people, and being suggestible to people or suggestive to people, helping people prepare in a way that they feel as comfortable as you possibly can be going into a completely unknown space, which makes pretty much everybody nervous, but
As
not priming
good.
people to have specific experiences. I know just from stories I've heard and having my own experiences with people sometimes, and it's very widespread in the spiritual communities, where it's like, oh, you're going to see an entity, and you're going to see like something Egyptian, and you're going to see like this, and you're going to see that. And that, I think, is profoundly, profoundly damaging for people. And we do it in overt ways, like I've just outlined, but we also actually do it in very subtle ways. And I think as a facilitator, to be so mindful of what you say to somebody, what you suggest they may or may not experience. So it's that priming and preparation
Mm.
process up front, but also mapping the life story. And then once somebody's gone through the experience, and this is a principle taught in shamanism, and I believe in that principle, is it very important to receive somebody back from that
Mm.
space. For a community of people, and that can be a community of two, it doesn't need to be a community of 100, but for a community to receive somebody back from that altered state, and just landing in a way that allows them to land in whichever way they want to land. And then the narrative process starts, at least for us, in the way that we work on site. As soon as somebody emerges and they've touched ground and they're back in their ordinary state of consciousness, and it's about receiving the information as they experienced it in the journey.
Mm.
And again, here, I think for as a facilitator, I find myself often watching myself where I want to provide, maybe a framework or an idea or an answer of something that I think can be hugely useful for a person. But unless they come to that knowledge in their own right, it's just me imposing something that
It's
may or may not fit for the person. So it's a delicate process, I think, of guiding somebody along a path and finding that balance between making meaning of the experience and making meaningful action points for going forward. Like, where do we focus our energy? What do we do? What are the areas that need to be looked at? And then to focus that narrative energy and that narrative process on helping people develop those narratives about themselves, and always keeping the story open, I think, is one of the principles that the book leans on very heavily, is keeping the narrative open and allowing the story to be revised constantly. I think the miracle narrative that goes with Ibogaine can be very damaging for people. It can cause a
mm,
lot of shame. It can cause a sense of failure if, I've pinned all my hope on Ibogaine and it was supposed to heal me and now I've relapsed.
right.
And what does that mean? Am I a failure? It didn't work for me. And a relapse, to me, is not a moral failure. It tells me that the scaffolding for somebody's emerging identity post Ibogaine is not yet in place. And there's an old identity structure that is still clinging to life, and that needs to be dismantled. And to have somebody work with you in that and keeping the narrative open in the sense that there's constant revision of who we are. We don't fundamentally change in our lives, I believe, but we're constantly revising who we are, upgrading or updating our values, or letting go of things that no longer fit, and to sort of keep this process open to be revised as we go along the way. One of the things that came out of the PhD research, and that is, I suppose, woven into how the book is written, but not explicitly published as a list, are these 12 aspects of the narrative self that Ibogaine reliably transforms in an adaptive way. And this also points to a place where practitioners can work with people on the integration process, and the 12 aspects are things like behavioral autonomy, psychological autonomy, purpose, connectedness, self-knowledge, self-insight, and looking at these 12 aspects and identifying, does the person feel like they have control over their thoughts after the Ibogaine journey? Yes. Okay. We don't need to focus too much on psychological autonomy. Is this a person who really struggles to set boundaries in their life? Yes. Okay, great. We need to figure out where behavioral autonomy needs to be strengthened. So
Mhm.
it provides this framework for really working with each individual person in a way that is relevant to where they are, who they are, and what they're struggling with, rather than saying, as an integration framework, meditation works for everyone, or, like hypnosis is a great modality. And I suppose the way that I wanted to go with the narrative framework is to step away from using modalities as an integration model and using the arc of what is needed for change as the integration model.
Yeah, I like that. I like that so much more, Marty, because you're right. While you might need different modalities at different times, it's not. It's a good idea to have breath work and this and that and the other. It's really the authority has the word author in it. You are the author of your own
Correct.
story, your own life and your life experience. And so getting connected with that and using that as the scaffolding is, makes a lot of sense. um, can you talk a little bit more about um, the steps, or what happens, or how do you make change happen? Because I think with addiction, for example, one of the biggest problems for anyone trying to change, I mean, try changing a habit like not drinking coffee first thing in the morning. It's so hard to do. So, we're all creatures of habit. We're called inhabitants. Maybe that's why. Um, but how do you change? Like, how do you actually initiate change in your story? Say you go home for Thanksgiving and you always have fights with your this uncle or sibling or whatever. How do you change that dynamic?
Okay. I think specifically from a substance use perspective is that I'm going to use nicotine as an example, because nicotine is a really difficult dependency to let go of. A lot of people really struggle with nicotine addiction, even using Ibogaine, and Ibogaine, for its addiction interrupting properties, can on some level interrupt the body's physiological need for nicotine. But nicotine is such a psychological um, dependency. We either identify as smokers or non-smokers, and everything that you identify with as a smoker, going to stand outside and having a little chat and meeting interesting people, or, like the calm and the anxiety relieving that comes from having your first cigarette. So people profoundly identify with something like nicotine dependence, and it becomes really difficult to figure out, well, how am I going to do without this? And Ibogaine can provide the initial interruption, but it's the unhooking from the part of yourself that relies on nicotine for something that is the longer process. And in that way, when you work with substance use disorder, every substance that people use, nobody would use a substance if it didn't serve a purpose. It serves a positive benefit to some extent for people, even though it also has profoundly negative aspects. There's also a positive aspect, something that people gain from using that substance, maybe numbing out from difficult emotions for a time, or social acceptance. But it's understanding which part of me relies on this particular thing that I depend on in order to function, and to start addressing the narrative change from that perspective. And it is about interrogating those parts of yourself. Which part of yourself identifies as a smoker? Which part of yourself likes being a smoker? Which part of yourself sees the value in continuing to be a smoker, over and above the sort of negative side of health aspects, maybe, or, social isolation or whatever. So I think it's about understanding which part of your identity needs to unhook. And that is not a momentary process. That is not the Ibogaine providing you insight into who you really are. And I think this is the beauty of why Ibogaine is such an incredibly special medicine. It gives you something to hang on to.
Mhm.
And in some ways, if it's taking away, your craving or your reliance on the substance, it also gives you an opportunity to hang on to something else. I'll never forget, many years ago, I worked with this wonderful, wonderful young man, and we were still working with opioids at the time, and he was struggling through the opioid detox from Ibogaine. It was profoundly difficult for him, as it is. It's hard on your body, it's hard on your mind. And he said to me, there was this very distinct moment, and he called it Ibogaine mind. And he said, there's this very distinct moment where the sun came up in my head. And inside of my head, the sun came up, and I realized everything that I'd been missing out on, everything that I am without the substance. And I think that's the gift that Ibogaine gives, is it gives this opportunity to understand in a very clear way, an alternative way to being. And if it's anger that you struggle with, maybe it's a more calm way of being. If it's a substance you struggle with, it's the sun coming up in your head the first time in years, where that dependency and that craving and that narrow focus on the substance is no longer there. So this also gives you the gift for integration, this glimpse into who you, some people say, truly are. I don't
Yeah.
know if I resonate with that to some extent. I suppose it is, but it is also another aspect of yourself that just was not that clear to you, or that you forgot about, or that you've never experienced about yourself. And that's why it gives you the roadmap for where to focus on in integration. So if you've got difficult family dynamics and difficult family relationships, how do you change that? By having that moment of insight that first, change is possible. It is possible to change a family dynamic. And I think very often not knowing that in an embodied way makes change very difficult.
So
And,
can
and
you
if
talk
you
a
don't,
bit more about family dynamic, how you change a family dynamic? Is that change something that happens only in you, or do you initiate change in the dynamic with the other person?
I think by changing your own dynamic, you are already changing the group dynamic. I think if your personal dynamic changes, let's say you've got a family member who likes to press your buttons, and your first go-to response is anger or hostility or defensiveness. And by not reacting or by disengaging or by turning around and walking away and, laughing it off or setting a boundary, a different approach. And it depends on what the dynamic is and who you're changing it. I think by reacting in a different way, the group dynamic can change and people start to change. We influence each other in very, very profound ways. And I think when you change yourself, that's always where it starts. The group dynamic can change. And there are other ways of changing a group dynamic by, for instance, having an honest conversation with somebody, improving the communication skills within that dynamic, or understanding how to set boundaries. Or understanding how to control your thoughts. Let's say you're going to a family affair and you're ruminating in anxiety about potentially what can happen in this dynamic. You're already walking into that dynamic with a sense of fear and anxiety. So by changing your own thought process leading up to the family gathering, you walk in with a different energy. And then that changes. So these are the narrative changes that you can make within yourself. You cannot control how other people react. They're going to react the way that they're going to react. But you can control how you react and how you react to the way that they are reacting. And in that way, potentially changes.
Yeah, it can be really profound and empowering because you can do it yourself. You don't need anything.
No.
So it sounds like you're suggesting a lot of journaling or some kind of recounting or understanding of your narrative, which I did it for years while I was doing intense psychedelics. I would have to journal to both integrate the experience and what it was saying and what it meant and what happened, and it helped a lot to have a journal and to kind of become conscious of the narrative and um, how you're being triggered by something and how you can be triggered by something in a social situation, and it's really stems from something from your past, that and so I guess it's kind of a skill building that you're talking about, personal.
Definitely a skill building process. I think narrative integration is absolutely a skill building process. And if we look at these sort of 12 aspects of the narrative self that I worked with for this work, that is where the skills building sits. You might not need to build skills in all 12 of these aspects, but identifying where do I need change? Do I need firmer boundaries? Do I need to control my thoughts? Do I need to stay connected with myself? Do I need to contemplate and reflect on my purpose as a person? So I think contemplation, I think journaling is a really healthy practice, and various types of journaling. People can sometimes get very passive aggressive when it comes to journaling because it feels like a chore and it feels like something I have to do. And I think, part of what I try and do is help people change their relationship with journaling and understanding it's an as when needed process. If you're struggling with something, pick up a book and write about it. Free flow writing really helps you to tap into what you are really feeling. So just putting pen to paper and writing, doing more structured writing can sometimes help. But I also think engaging in work with integration therapists or a coach or whoever you're working with, or just somebody to help you reflect. We experience ourselves, and other people can help us reflect on ourselves much better and much more objectively than we can ourselves. And I know for a lot of Ibogaine providers work to capacity. An Ibogaine provider has a lot on their plate. They have medical safety concerns to consider. They have during the journey, holding that space for people, and that's an energetic ask from an Ibogaine provider, and then helping people to start with the initial integration process. So my view in the last few years especially has been that Ibogaine integration is not the job of Ibogaine providers necessarily. Of course, Ibogaine providers who can build that skill and capacity by all means, but also to be able to build that skill and capacity within the Ibogaine community so that there are more Ibogaine integration coaches available to help people reflect on how they are doing. And in this way, there are some coaches who will go with a very structured approach to narrative integration. My approach to narrative integration is more unstructured, from the perspective that I don't know what's happening in your life. You are living your life. And 3 weeks after the Ibogaine journey, you feel like you're smooth sailing along a path. I think an informal check-in is usually enough at that point. And if you run up into an obstacle, this is what I'm struggling with. That's the time to really start looking at how that narrative integration work. I think with certain clients, probably need more scaffold building from the beginning, and other clients need less scaffold building.
It's
But
so
it's the
much
ability, sorry, it's the ability to meet somebody where they are, not where you are as a facilitator or an integration coach.
right. Like you were saying, so much of it depends on who you are, how old you are, what your past experience is, what your level of evolution as a human being is, which is a concept that can transcend just the span of your own life, depending on how you look at what you are as a human being or a soul, or what happens when you die. Do you Is there reincarnation? These are all like big themes that can come into this idea of who am I. And these medicines open up those doorways in very profound ways that are difficult to talk about, but nonetheless influence your sense of identity. And so for me, for my story, you were saying, I hope you'll touch back on it. The most profound thing that happened for me was understanding that I was not just a personality, I was something beyond a personality, in that disassociation that you talk about. And the knowing that there's something of me that exists beyond death, and I'm not going to frame it or define it. I just know that there is something that exists, and that exists through time in a different way. So all of these things bring up questions about what you know innately, that you bring to the journey. And I think this is where for me as a layperson, listening to the therapist conversation or the things on social media, the kind of compartmentalizing of things, or saying that it's fixed, it's like this, you're going to see this, you're going to have this means this. It's very harmful, in my view, to someone understanding. So could you, I don't know whether there's a question in here, but could you speak to that a little bit?
Well, like I said, I think it's such a highly individual process. And I think even the integration process after Ibogaine is a highly individual process. There's some commonality, certainly. People experience certain type of common reactions. Maybe there's a reduced need for sleep. So some people are concerned about sleep. So there's always sort of standardized ways, in some ways, that I think we can approach integration. But I think integration is a highly individual need for each person. And while somebody might need a clinical psychologist for integration, another person needs a coach, or another person needs a shaman for their integration, in terms of who they are as a person. What helps you to make sense of who you are? That's ultimately the primary goal of the integration process. Is now that you've gained an insight about yourself, and reliably, Ibogaine, and this is the thing that came out of the PhD research that was fascinating for me, of these 12 aspects of the narrative self that I investigated, self-insight is the one thing that most reliably comes from an Ibogaine journey. Most of the participants felt they gained self-insight. Very few participants gained brand new knowledge about themselves. So that was the least experienced of all the aspects, was brand new knowledge. And the most common is self-insight. So underneath who we are, we know who we are. We know what we like. We don't know what we don't like. We don't always have access to these parts of ourselves. And then Ibogaine comes and removes this layer, and it gives you this metacognitive perspective on who you are, what you do, how you like to do things, and who you are as a person. And then taking those insights and working through those insights with somebody to help you reflect on them. How do I make this a permanent change in my life? How do I stop my, let's say, rumination is something that you really struggle with. Ibogaine provides this almost effortless mindfulness straight out of the gates after Ibogaine. And it's almost like you have the ability to notice your patterns without much effort in the beginning. But that's the point of the window that Ibogaine creates, is to understand in this window, I'm ruminating again. Hang on, what can I do about this? What kind of rumination? And we live in the 21st century. We've got the most incredible tools at our fingertips where you can literally type into your AI, into your search function, whatever it is that you do, go, I'm struggling with rumination. What can I do? And AI spits out 5 things, and you're like, none of that resonates with me. Cool. Let me go and look for a therapist. Let me go and look for somebody
Or let me go
who
find a book. Sometimes
or a
just
book, or a song. Maybe if I experimented with music a little bit, it stops me from ruminating so much. Or maybe I should switch off the news. Maybe the news is contributing to my rumination at the moment. So it's really kind of like the ability to identify those aspects of self, but then to work with them. And I think this is often where people fall down in the integration process. It's this idea that the molecule will do the work for you, and the molecule is only the threshold, it's only the door. And what sits on the other side of it is you working through this and going, okay, I'm struggling with rumination. Let me not hope it'll go away. Let me make an effort. Let me sit with it.
yeah.
For substance use disorders, very often I say to clients, before the idea of, oh, I can pick up a drink at some point in my life again, before that idea takes hold, intervene. Because if you don't, it becomes a familiar thought pattern that is already resting upon an older identity structure. So disrupt the identity structure at every moment during the integration process, not in a way that is disruptive to your sense of self, in a way that is compassionate and curious in this metacognitive perspective. And this is also, I think, where integration coaches and guides can be very effective to say, sure, you're being very harsh on yourself, or you're being very critical on yourself. Yes, let's work with this rumination, but let's also look at how you are doing it. Like that voice is very critical. So having outside input into your process, I think, is very valuable. Having a guided process is very valuable. But you can also guide yourself through that process if you reflect, journaling, contemplation, various types of modalities.
Yeah, for those who are on a very tight budget and can just afford the Ibogaine treatment, they don't have to then be abandon themselves. They can actually use this. And we're putting up some of these resources, many different teachers on awake.net, with this very idea in mind of giving people resources, tools for integration, and a community of not just healers but other people going through similar kinds of things, so that they can find people like you and other people, because sometimes you need something. I have found that sometimes you need something completely different from everything you've tried before.
Yeah. I'm an observer of some of the social media groups, and I'm not particularly social media savvy, but in some of the groups that I'm on, I'm fascinated by the conversations that I see play out. And it's so encouraging for me to see, I'm struggling with X. How do I get past this? And there's usually and there's not like one like or one comment. There's a flood of comments of people saying, well, try this or try that, or look at this or look at that. And that's really valuable input. If anybody posts a comment on how do I stop my room, I'm really ruminating still after I began. Has anybody experienced this? And it becomes a sense of validation by a community, but also, oh yes, I experienced this and I tried that. And I think some of the social media groups certainly that I'm I'm part of are really great at providing that level of feedback for somebody. Social media being social media can also turn quite toxic in the other way. So it's always got the sort of upside and the downside, but creating communities where people do feel supported, like what awake.net does in terms of resources, but also, other Ibogaine providers or informal groups of people, who get together and really help each other with some of these processes.
Right. Right. It's out there and you can find it. Uh, I just have a comment on the word rumination. Is rumination a bad thing? Because
I
I
think
read
it
something to
is.
the contrary that some amount of rumination is good for the brain.
I think there's a difference between contemplation and rumination, and I would make the difference that contemplating is looking and focusing on almost a sense of hyper focus, if you will, on a particular topic. And that can be a very healthy pursuit. Rumination specifically refers to a spiraling thought pattern, where it's the inability of unhooking yourself from that thought pattern and being able to think about other productive things because it's intrusive by nature. And contemplation is more an activity by choice. You go into a state, and yes, you might go into even a trance state in that contemplation, where some of your volitional control is reduced. But rumination, very specifically, is the inability to unhook yourself from this thought pattern. It's extremely intrusive, and usually it leads to quite a lot of anxiety because of the inability to unhook yourself from this intrusive thought pattern that has almost hijacked your thought process. So that's what I mean by rumination.
Got it. Yeah. So it's not the same as daydreaming. It's
No,
something
daydream
different.
is wonderful. I've always said one of my favorite activities is staring at the wall, because it's just about sometimes letting your thoughts go wherever they want to go, switching off the phone, switching off the news, switching off everything else, and just looking at the wall without even focusing on it and just letting your mind drift a little bit. I mean, for me, there's nothing more relaxing than just kind of letting your thoughts wander.
Yeah. Well, thank you for the clarification. Um, So could you talk a little bit about that 3-month window afterwards? You said that right afterwards, some kind of aftercare is needed for people to a place to land, etc. And then they go home, and there's that 3-month window where Ibogaine is in your system. How can a person who's going through integration maximize that 3-month window?
I think Ibogaine reliably brings a sense of motivation, a sense of mental clarity. It brings a sense of grounded, empowered understanding of self. Obviously, there are variations, and the 3-month window I think is also incredibly important to address because not everybody has a 3-month window. That depends very heavily on your metabolic system. Some people have very fast metabolic systems. So, whatever Ibogaine was metabolized into Ibogaine will probably leave your body a little bit quicker. So I'm hesitant to say there's a 3-month window, again, because if somebody, after a month feels like they need a lot more help than what they should be needing, it can bring in this aspect of shame. So it's always about what are you experiencing in any particular moment in time. And if you feel you need, let's say, you're using microdosing as a way of continuing your recovery from a substance use disorder, for instance, in the immediate aftermath of an Ibogaine journey. Some people will hold off on wanting to microdose because, I shouldn't need it right now. I just did Ibogaine. I should be feeling great. So it's always, I want to get rid of this idea that there's a should of how it should happen. The only way it should happen is the way that it's happening with you. And understanding that the way that it's happening with me, what do I need? So reliably, you go into the space of, feeling really good, a sense of motivation. And I think when you have a sense of motivation, making those lifestyle changes is capitalizing on what Ibogaine brings into your space, whether it's, dietary changes or thought process changes, or maybe setting boundaries, relational changes. In that window, it's almost like the want to do it is there. The motivation to do it is there. So that's how I would say using that window,
Yes.
really kind of to identify what is it that I need. What do I need? Do I need to work with somebody early? Can I leave it a little bit? Am I doing okay for now? I think having somebody to check in with you to say, well, what is happening in your life at
Super
this
important.
particular moment in time? So it's difficult to say what should happen in the 3 months after, because what should happen for me in the 3 months after looks very different from what should happen for you in the 3 months after. And it might not even be 3 months for you. It might be 2 weeks for you, and you might need a different intervention. You might need, hypnosis, or you might need a meditation retreat, or you might need journaling, or you might need psychiatric assistance. It's
Do you
different for
recommend
each person.
people doing another entheogen in the 3 months after, whether it's microdosing or whether microdosing seems to be okay, but other journey, when do you think is a good?
I'm, yeah, I'm not a purist at all. I think there are a lot of substances that are very complementary to Ibogaine. I think psilocybin is hugely complementary to Ibogaine, and my view has always been that Ibogaine works with your head, and the mushies primarily work with your heart. And that's not to say Ibogaine doesn't work with your heart and psilocybin doesn't work with your head. They do. They do kind of cross over in this way, but my framing of it is that the Ibogaine helps you sort out your head, and the mushrooms help you sort out your heart, or sort of connect the head with the heart. So I think there are certain psychedelics that are very complementary to Ibogaine. I think there are also a lot of medicines that are absolutely not complementary to Ibogaine, and I think from my perspective, primarily sort of elevated psychological risk. I'm personally not a huge fan of cannabis. I understand that very many people are fans of cannabis. I've always thought that cannabis and Ibogaine are not particularly good friends. Maybe other practitioners have different opinions and experiences. My experience of this, and also certainly, just the level of THC present in what cannabis is available, can cause problems after Ibogaine. So I would steer clear of that. But I think psilocybin is something that can be used in a very complementary way. I think mescaline is something that is very complementary. I think MDMA is not at all complementary,
Really?
not at all complementary in sort of short succession to Ibogaine. And I feel the same way about cannabis. And in that way, I'm always a fan of giving each experience its own space to exist in. So if you go to a clinic and you receive Ibogaine and 5-MeO in the same retreat week, it's absolutely fine. But cap that experience, because the learnings come
Yeah.
from that experience, and integrate the learnings from that experience, each sort of element adding its own flavor to the experience, but ultimately integrating the experience as a whole, rather than sort of chasing whatever it is. Now I've discovered psychedelics, now I want to do every psychedelic on the planet. You're welcome to, but just give yourself enough time in between if you're using them from a therapeutic perspective. If you're doing them recreationally, it's a very different story. But to give each substance sort of its own reverence. But I'm not against using other psychedelics with Ibogaine. I think some of them are very complementary.
So again, that sounds like it's an individual kind of thing based on where the person is and who they are, and all of those factors come into deciding. But I just wanted to bring it up as an option that here, you can go on your own journey where you kind of self-guide yourself to different teachers or different medicines, and with the understanding that what you is a moving target in this scenario, right?
Definitely. Definitely, definitely, definitely. And I think also, dose dependent on some of those complementary substances. I'm very much a fan of not using standard dosing as far as a complementary psychedelic experience is concerned. I loved her to death, and she was an absolutely amazing person. But Ansu, my business partner who passed away, her philosophy was to shoot everybody out of the biggest rocket that she could find.
Yeah,
And that was
I like that.
uh, it was her life philosophy in very many ways. I'm the more measured, sort of pragmatic handbrake of the pair, and I kind of look at what is complementary for a person's process. And I think, if you are working with psilocybin and ibogaine together, if somebody's had a very, very big, profound, moving, complex, complicated, difficult experience with ibogaine, then also following that up shortly with a very high dose of psilocybin, which can be very destabilizing in its own way, or a very high dose of 5-MeO. I don't know 5-MeO that well, but I'm assuming dose dependent, you can take people to very difficult places. That can
Right.
be extremely destabilizing for somebody. So to really look at the person who's in front of you, getting to know them, what is just unfolded from their ibogaine process and experience, and what could be in consultation with them, because as the facilitator, you're not the sole decision maker in this process. The person that you're working with has full autonomy to co-decide with you. And you can make a recommendation on what you think can be useful for the person, but to sort of err on the side of caution is my approach. And to you provide guidance to say, maybe this will work or maybe that will work. What do you want to experience? What is it that you want to go and look for? Or this is what I see. What do you think? And I think in that way, also keeping the narrative open from that starting point, so that somebody always understands this is my process. I'm the author of this experience, and I can take advice, but ultimately I need to decide every single step of this narrative process going forward. So that's part of it, I think.
Yeah, I call it awakening the inner shaman, because, or the inner healer, that's really what you're doing. You're the one who is healing yourself, ultimately. Uh,
Definitely.
yeah. So can you, uh, I thought of something as you were talking about where people are, and what they might experience with Ibogaine. Do you work with people who have mental health issues or taking SSRIs, and how do you deal with that? And what kind of mental health issues does Ibogaine help? Because a lot of people are talking about this, and asking about it.
I mean, I've had my fair share of really complex psychological presentations. And I don't want to give too much detail, because in a way you can't really talk about some of these individual cases in a composite way. That doesn't reveal too much about the person. But, I think what I can safely say, and if I look at the clinical guidelines that were written in 2015, which I think was a landmark document, and everybody who was involved in that, such an enormous, enormous, enormous safety net for Ibogaine as a field.
Are
And
you
looking
talking
at
about the Hunter document?
the clinical guidelines that were written in 2015.
Yeah.
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 And I think some of the psychological exclusions in that document, and I think borderline personality disorder was mentioned, I think schizophrenia was mentioned. I think what I can say safely is my mind has changed a lot in terms of what is possible with Ibogaine. And I think it very much depends on the practitioner understanding what they are working with and what is a safe way of working with Ibogaine. And I didn't learn this because I'm awesome. I learned this because I made mistakes, and we make mistakes along the way, and we see what happens under certain circumstances, whether it's, bipolar disorder, or somebody with a very severe treatment resistant form of depression, or whether it's somebody with a more severe psychological disorder. What happens, what is the good and the bad that happens from some of these extreme cases. And very often they were not sort of ideas that I could exclude based on the screening, because maybe somebody didn't come with a diagnosis. And through the process unfolding, you realize, oh shit, okay, this is what's happening here, or this is what may be happening. Where's the supervision on the psych end to help me make sense of it? You come across some of these cases, and in a way, I think that's why I love and revere Ibogaine so much. It is a wise, intelligent, gentle, kind, very, very, very clever medicine, because even in the way that it works with certain people that I thought would not at all be candidates for Ibogaine, worked in a very profound, very soft, very beautiful way, stabilizing way, not a destabilizing way. for people and with certain types of psychological conditions. So I wouldn't want to sort of put that out there because I think we need tons more research to understand it before it's something that we start talking about in the Ibogaine community. But I think there's something to investigate in terms of how Ibogaine can help. And the other thing I think is to consider that a flood dose of Ibogaine is not the only way to work with Ibogaine. There are other ways of working with Ibogaine that can be less risky medically, most certainly, but also psychologically for certain people who may be considered vulnerable in certain ways. And to provide certain support that definitely needs to be in place for more severe psychological disorders. But that there's also different ways of working with Ibogaine that is more gentle, where it's not everybody has to have a flood dose of Ibogaine.
Right.
A flood dose is not the only way to work with people, and specifically for people who are very fearful of the experience or who are very scared that they're not going to be okay. That fear factor can factor into it, and it can have a positive transformation, but can also move into a different realm.
If they resist it too much going into it, it can create, yeah, yeah. So can you, when you say if somebody is looking for a clinic and they're asking, what would they be asking for, finding out other than flood dose? Is there a term for it? What?
Well, some people talk about a mesodosing protocol. I think the word mesodosing has not been used very widely. There's one of two practitioners that I'm aware of who uses the term mesodosing. And some people talk about a macro dose and a micro dose, and I suppose the mesodose is in the middle. The way that I look at it is a micro dose, a mesodose, and a flood dose. That's my terminology. There may be other practitioners who use that differently. But the mesodose is this space in the middle where we're working with a high quality form of Ibogaine. We're working at a lower daily dosing and in a compounded way rather than in a single flood way. And that produces a very interesting experience, even from an altered state perspective. The altered state with Ibogaine, if there is an altered state, looks very different. It's usually a whole lot shorter. And in a lot of ways, the volitional control in that mesodosing state of consciousness is distinctly different, but still very much distinctly Ibogaine.
Oh, that sounds wonderful, actually. It sounds very, very nice. Is that something, so that's something that you work with? Is that the rhythm that you like to work with? Or
It's something that we started doing a year ago, and at the moment we're kind of tinkering with it. We're experimenting with it to see, what happens. And I think it started out of a need to provide a space for people to work with Ibogaine who may in some way be psychologically excluded from working with Ibogaine, or medically excluded from working with Ibogaine. And how does someone still gain some or all of the benefits of what Ibogaine can bring in a space that doesn't necessitate a flood dose? And that's where we started with this. It's not a new approach. I mean, Claire Wilkins published a paper quite a few years ago on a slow dose protocol, and I think that was for methadone specifically, if memory serves. So this is not new information in terms of using a slower sort of meso type protocol. But we're using it not from an opioid detoxification perspective. We're using it from addressing variety
like
of issues that
spiritual?
people arrive with, psychological, psychospiritual, trauma.
I
I think
see.
there are still certain approaches that work better for some things. Like I said earlier, definitely an opioid detoxification needs a very different approach, in my opinion, anyway. And I think also that PTSD benefits more from a flood dose experience.
Oh,
And I think it has to do with surrendering some of that volitional control. Someone with PTSD generally has quite evolved defense mechanisms, and that flood is a way of breaking down those defense mechanisms. So yeah, I think there are new ways emerging, and certainly practitioners experimenting in their own spaces of different ways of working with Ibogaine. And I think, with a substance like this, where there's always a medical risk attached, creating avenues for people to access this medicine that's safe, and that looks at, well, what are all the possible things that can still go wrong using a mesodosing protocol. And I read some of the more recent safety papers that came out, which is really encouraging, looking at, I think they looked at 19,000 case studies, and what they thought the fatality rate of Ibogaine is and what it looks like now. And that's changed significantly. And I think the clinical guidelines and awareness has had a major impact on that. But looking at making Ibogaine available to wider audiences also, I think, will necessitate working with Ibogaine in different ways where we access the benefits of this medicine and even the non-ordinary state benefits of this medicine without necessarily putting somebody in a medical situation or potentially a psychological situation.
So, do you think the slowing of the heart, the QT interval, is a part of the mechanism of action in terms of how it changes your, al- in terms of the altered state, or do you have any sense about that? Because I've thought that something is happening there. There's a gap, and that's kind of a metaphysical term too. The gap.
That's interesting. I've actually never thought about the metaphysical aspects of the QT because we're always so kind of focused on the medical side of things. You know, as a practitioner, your primary objective is to make sure somebody comes out alive on the other side, and that means watching that QT. So yeah, I suppose on a metaphysical level, whether there is a slowing down and the sort of bradycardia that it induces, I think you can make that link to it. Um, from my perspective, what people experience more of in terms of perceptual effect is, in fact, not at all a slowing down of the heart, probably quite the opposite. People feeling their hearts beat very fast or their hearts beating very loudly. So, as a perceptual kind of effect during the Ibogaine journey, very few people describe calm. It's usually not a feeling of feeling calm or a slowing down of.
Yeah.
Um, and a lengthening of a QT, I don't know if that's necessarily slowing. I suppose it is slowing down. I've never really thought about
Hopefully.
it that
Yeah.
way.
Well, I just wondered, if you had if knew anything about that. Um, so I'd like to open it up to questions, but is there anything else you want to talk about, address in terms of the book before I do that?
Um, no, I think we've touched on quite a lot of it. If anything comes to mind, I'll open my mouth.
So, does anyone have any questions? Well, I guess not. Um,
Congrats. Good luck, Vincent. Or it's April Vincent, right? Good
April,
luck with
she's
your
left, I think.
treatment on the 29th of June. I hope that goes really well for you.
I think she left already. But
I have one. I have one.
who's that?
My name is Kyle.
Okay, I just want to find you and okay, go ahead.
Oh,
Kyle.
yes.
Hello.
Yeah. Um, Thank you, Marty. That was so insightful. And it seemed that you're getting younger and younger. I don't know how you do that.
Ibogaine, it's good for the skin.
Um, Recently, I've been following uh, Beyond, I forgot the name, based in Mexico. And the founder actually uh, made an interview uh, with regard to a book that he released named Big Camera.
Oh, yes, okay. It's
Yeah,
Jonathan's book, The Bicameral Mind. Yeah.
yeah. Um, so I try to understand so the concept about, which is very important, I think, and but I do not read your book actually, and I did not read his book, so so I may be naive in and lack of data pertaining to that question that I'm asking. Mm, but it's a very good point that he raised, actually.
It's a very interesting idea. I mean, I'd never heard of the concept of the bicameral mind. I thought it was fascinating.
Yeah, because I think from my point of view, it's the level of dedication and what you need actually to assist somebody um, uh, about bicameral, because some are more equal than others, you see. Yeah, and also I want it's a sharing, Martin. I also vision a sharing from friends, which Charles, or I may be wrong, that he did um, psychedelics, and after that, and he was cured. Like he got the revelation. Say, okay, so you come from where you come from, and that was beautiful because um, the way he presented it, and he was so posed, um, and he embodied uh, like a wholeness person that accept life as uh, as he is, and um, as this world projected, like um, we are in a big theater, so yeah, and you're doing a very great job, Martin.
Thank you.
Uh,
Thank you.
yeah, and and I'm here to help if I can be useful to you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yep. That's all. That's all.
Thank you. Kyle Chandraya, is that how you say your name?
It's yeah. It's
Chandra.
Kyle. It's Don. Or yeah. Is it,
Thank-
Donovan. Yeah.
So I don't think there's any other questions, and we could close early. But could you say a little bit? Could you just tell people where they can find you? Um, and your book is on Amazon. I think somebody said it's out of print, by the way.
So I think Amazon probably print on demand. So they'll probably print a few little copies to start off with. I've got a publishing website called Roots and Ruins, or just on my own website, which is martieunderwood.com.
Okay, martieunderwood.com. That's easy.
See.
Well, thank you so much for your interview and explanation and everything you shared about this process of unraveling story and Ibogaine. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for the invite. I really appreciate it. Thanks,
Can
guys.
I ask a question, or are we
Is that Paul?
or it's a question, but also that can be informative for the participants which are present. Magalese is, for me, is like top notch and top notch. The protocol has changed a lot since inception. Or it's like on a case-to-case basis.
Is that the
That's my
question?
yeah.
No, it's not on a case-to-case basis. I think it's just an evolution of where we are. It's an evolution of the regulatory landscape in South Africa. I think the regulatory landscape in South Africa has impacted profoundly where I am sitting right now in this moment and some of the things happening in the background that we're working on. So no, we don't change a protocol on a case-by-case basis, although we have different protocols that we work with. And again, it would be a recommendation of what a protocol would be. But again, it's a co-authorship with somebody as to what they feel will be most beneficial for them. And I'm not going to force a protocol on somebody because I think it's the right way of doing it. I think it's about helping somebody figure out what may be the most beneficial for them. But ultimately, them still buying into that approach, or they're not. But there are certain things that we no longer do. And that's, I think, driven more by the regulatory landscape than the clients themselves or the participants. That's more sort of just exposure and regulatory wise.
Yeah, that's a
Okay.
dance that all Ibogaine providers have to do in the landscape right now. It's quite something. Yeah, so thank you for doing what you do with Magalese. It's such important work, and you've been doing it for such a long time. So thank you so much. This will be on, the recording will be on awake.net/Ibogaine. All the recordings of this series will be on there. It'll be up in a few days. So,
Thank you, Lakshmi.
alrighty.
Bye.